Well, Reza Aslan was a Christian but converted back to the faith of his forefathers. It's Islam. He has now written a book about Jesus. The book has become controversial as it calls into question some of the core tenets of Christianity. The book is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And Reza joins me now from Los Angeles. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is an interesting book. Now, I want to clarify, you're a Muslim, so why did you write a book about the founder of Christianity?
Well, to be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including one in the New Testament and fluency in Biblical Greek, who has been studying the origins of Christianity for 2 decades, who also just happens to be a Muslim. So it's not that I'm just some Muslim writing about Jesus. I am an expert with a PhD in the history of religions. But I have been obsessed with Jesus.
Though, it still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually. So, I mean, it would be like asking a Christian why they would write a book about, Islam. I'm not sure about that. But honestly, I've been obsessed with Jesus for really 20 years. I've been studying his life and his work and the origins of Christianity both in an academic environment and in a personal level for about 2 decades. And just to be clear, this is not some attack on Christianity. My mother is a Christian. My wife is a Christian. My brother-in-law is an evangelical pastor. Anyone who thinks that this book is an attack on Christianity has not read it yet.
But I want to read you some quotes from some people who are criticizing you. One from John Dickerson, who has written an op-ed piece on VoxNews.com, and he says, it's not a historian's report on Jesus. Is it an educated Muslim's opinion about Jesus? He says its conclusions are long-held Islamic claims, namely that Jesus was a zealous prophet type who didn't claim to be God.
Well, that's actually not what Islam claims about Jesus. My book about Jesus overturns pretty much everything that Islam also thinks about Jesus as well. And to be clear, I just want to emphasize this one more time. I am a historian. I am a PhD in the history of religions. This isn't a Muslim opinion. This is an academic work of history, not about the Christ or about Christianity for that matter. It's about a historical man who walked the earth 2,000 years ago in a land that the Romans called Palestine. How
are your findings different from what Islam actually believes about Jesus?
Well, Islam doesn't believe that Jesus was crucified, first of all. Islam believes in the virgin birth. I mean, Jesus was most definitely crucified, and my book does question the historicity of the virgin birth. So again, I mean, I know that we've mentioned this 3 times now. I'm not sure what my faith happens to do with my 20 years of academic study of the New Testament.
I'm just trying to bring out what some others are claiming at this point, and I want you to answer to those claims, which is...
Well, it's pretty clear that there are those who actually do not like the book, who are, unhappy with its general arguments. That's perfectly fine. I'm more than willing to talk about the arguments of the book itself, but I do think it's perhaps a little bit strange that rather than debating the arguments of the book, we are debating the right of the scholar to actually write it.
Well, let me give you some other quotes from Dr. William Lane Craig, who is a Christian philosopher and theologian. He's written a lot of books and done a lot of debates about science and religion. He said Reza Aslan merely repeats bygone claims about the historical Jesus that have since been abandoned and refuted. What do you say to that?
Well, I would disagree. I have 100 pages of notes and about 1,000 books that I use in my discussions. And of course, in any scholarly discussion of Jesus, as with any scholarly discussion of any ancient figure, there are going to be widespread differences. But my 100 pages of endnotes cites every scholar who disagrees with me and every scholar who agrees with me. And I would suggest that anyone who wants to actually comment on the argument of the book read not just the book, but the endnotes, and to figure out where my scholarly argument about Jesus comes from. And I'm sure you're going to find people who disagree with me.
Right, exactly. What are your, we're not talking about just people who disagree with you. Scholars, many scholars disagree with you as well. But I want to get to the heart of, what are your conclusions about Jesus?
Well, my conclusions about Jesus start by placing him in the world in which he lived. So I start with one fundamental truth that everyone agrees on with Jesus, and that was that he was crucified. You have to understand that crucifixion in first century Palestine was a punishment that Rome reserved exclusively for crimes against the state, like sedition or rebellion, treason, or insurrection. The thieves who were crucified alongside Jesus were not thieves. The Greek word lestes means bandit. And bandit was the most common term in Jesus' time for an insurrectionist. What I say is that if you know nothing else about Jesus except that he was crucified, you know enough to understand what a troublemaker this guy must have been. The movement that he started was such a threat to the political stability of the empire that they actually had him arrested, tortured, and killed for it. So I start with that fundamental fact, and then I take the claims of the Gospels, as every single biblical scholar for 200 years has done, and look at them in light of the history of this world that we know. And what's interesting about Jesus' world is that we know a lot about it, thanks to the Romans, who were very good at documentation. And the picture that arises from this is of a real political revolutionary who took on the religious and political powers of his time on behalf of the poor and the meek, the dispossessed, the marginalized, who sacrificed himself in his cause for those who couldn't stand up for himself, and whose death ultimately launched the greatest religion in the world.
Yeah, I want you to ask, actually there's another chat coming, and I want to get this on before we end this interview. Taylor Kane just says, so your book is written with clear bias, and you're trying to say it's academic. That's like having a Democrat write a book about why Reagan wasn't a good Republican. It just doesn't work.
Well,
what do you say to that?
It would be like a Democrat with a PhD in Reagan who has been studying his life and history for 2 decades writing a book about Reagan.
But then why would a Democrat want to promote democracy by writing about a Republican? I see that the point is that...
Ma'am, may I just finish my sentence for a moment, please? I think that the fundamental problem here is that you're assuming that I have some sort of faith-based bias in this work that I write. I write about Judaism, I write about Hinduism, I write about Christianity, I write about Islam. My job as a scholar of religions with a PhD in the subject is to write about religions. And one of the religions that I have written about is the religion
that was
launched by Jesus.
You're not just writing about a religion from a point of view of an observer. I mean, the thing about it is that you're promoting yourself as a scholar, and I've interviewed scholars who have written books on the resurrection, on the real Jesus, and who are looking at the same information that you're saying. To say that your information is somehow different from theirs is really not being honest here.
Ma'am, my information is not different from theirs at all. I'm afraid that it sounds like you haven't actually read my book or seen what I've said about the resurrection or about Jesus or about his claims. I think you might be surprised in what I say. And there have been thousands of scholars who have written about this very same topic, many who disagree with me, many who agree with me. That's the thing about scholarship, is that it's a debate over ancient history, and I am one of those people making that debate. I think it's unfair to just simply assume, because of my particular faith background, that there is some agenda on this book. That would be like saying that a Christian who writes about Muhammad is by definition, not able to do so because he has some bias against it. And frankly, every book that's almost every book that's out there is by Christians.
But I believe that you've been on several programs and never disclosed that you were a Muslim, and I think that's an interesting full disclosure.
Ma'am, the second page of my book says I'm a Muslim. Every single interview I have ever done on TV or on print says I'm a Muslim. You may not be familiar with me, but I'm actually quite a prominent Muslim thinker in the United States. I've written a number of books about Islam. It's just simply incorrect to say that media isn't saying that I'm a Muslim. I would actually encourage you to actually try to find media that doesn't mention my biography, which, by the way, again, is on the second page of the book.
All right, Reza, I want to thank you very much for coming on. The book is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. I want to thank you for coming on a Spirited Debate. Thank you.
Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. My name is Sophia, I'm your host. The aim of Let the Quran Speak is to help you gain deeper insights into Muslims and Islam as it's practiced here and in other parts of the world. Reza Aslan wrote a book called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Aslan was featured on Fox News, where he was questioned extensively on his credentials as a Muslim, writing about a central figure in Christianity. Since then, his book has skyrocketed to fame on Amazon.com. It's also featured on the New York Times Top 10 list. What is interesting and new about Aslan's work? Does it stand up to historical analysis? And how would biblical scholars, devout Christians, and Muslims view his book? Dr. Shabir Ally, president of the Islamic Information Center, is here to help us answer those questions. Dr. Shabir Ally, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
Now, you've had a chance to look at the book. What are your thoughts on the book? We don't want to talk about the interview too much, but we're interested in the book itself.
Yeah, the book is interesting. It's different from many other books I've read because while being a scholarly piece of writing, at the same time, many parts of it read like, as one reviewer has put it, like a fast-paced novel. The writer, therefore, demonstrates great literary skill in bringing to a popular readership many of the conclusions which are known from the scholarly writings on the life and times of Jesus, on whom be peace.
He calls Jesus, on whom be peace, a zealot. And in our understanding of the word zealot, it's a kind of a negative term. But it seems like he's using it in a different sense. Can you explain what sort of sense he's using it?
Of course, we know the term zealot in the sense of an enthusiast, perhaps even more than an enthusiast. Well,
almost crazed in a sense. Yeah.
The way he describes the historical situation in which Jesus found himself has to do with that term. Before and after Jesus, there have been, as documented by Reza Aslan in this book, many individuals who either referred to themselves as messiahs, or nonetheless they pursued a program or preached the need for the Jews at the time to throw off the yoke of foreign governance, especially Roman rule at the time of Jesus. And these individuals are actually known and referred to as zealots. Now, in the New Testament, it is mentioned that some persons were zealous for the law, but it is also known that there were certain other individuals mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament who were zealous in a different way, zealous to establish the kingdom and rule of God on earth, and hence to throw off the yoke of Roman rule.
So Aslan is saying that Jesus was zealous in this way. Is this accurate? We often think of Jesus as sort of a peace-loving individual who didn't want a theocratic state. But he's saying something different.
The interpretation that Jesus was zealous in this way is a popular one among biblical scholars.
Okay.
Though, of course, it does not fit the image of Jesus as a gentle and peace-loving individual. So how do we reconcile these two images? Well, according to Aslan, and many others hold the same view, the Gospels were written much later, after Jesus had left the scene, by a few decades later. The earliest of the four Gospels is that of Mark. That was written around the year 70. Aslan says sometime after 70, shortly after that. And this would be about 4 decades after Jesus had left the scene. And Matthew and Luke were written, according to Aslan again, somewhere between the years 80 to 100. And John's Gospel, the last of them, somewhere between 100 to 120. So much later still. Now, in the intervening time, what has happened is that the Romans came in and completely destroyed Jerusalem and its inhabitants. So the surviving Jews found it necessary for them to think of their faith as something that they could live with under this tremendous force of Roman occupation. And what they found convenient for them was at the time to not promote their faith as something that would rub contrary to the demands of the state. Christians at the time were one movement within Judaism. This was a Jewish following that believed that their Messiah had come in the person of Jesus Christ, but still a Jewish following. And so if they were also under scrutiny of the Roman rulers, who were looking for anyone who would be zealous in that way and who would pose a threat to Roman rule. And the best way forward for the writers that represented Jesus, such as Mark, for example, would be to represent Jesus as being non-threatening to the Roman state. And this is how Jesus has received. So his
image evolved then?
Yes, his image has evolved in the minds of the Christian congregations that produced the documents that we now have about Jesus.
So in other words, the Jesus of the past might have been similar to what we know of Muhammad today. Muhammad being, a political reformer, wanting to establish a sort of state or a Muslim polity of some sort.
This is a very complex question, and I don't know if I can give a simple answer to that, because it's another question as to what was the Prophet Muhammad's own agenda. And I would argue, as I've explained elsewhere and on this show as well, that in my reading of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I see him as the Quran depicts him, as a prophet like previous prophets, and the Quran does not depict Jesus as a revolutionary. Nor does the Quran depict other prophets as revolutionaries. There are only a few prophets in the Quran who actually ruled states. The notable exceptions would be Moses, David, and Solomon. Even Abraham is shown in the Bible to have gone into battle, but in the Quran he's not shown to have gone into battle.
So then, do you think that, to go back to Reza Aslan's book, do you think that his book is an inaccurate representation of Jesus?
No, I would say that what is known among scholars in the field of historical studies about Jesus fits very well with what Reza Aslan has depicted. The Gospels are the main source of knowledge about Jesus, and they contain many threads of evidence. Because the Gospels are written by many different individuals who also collected stories that were available to them, and the stories come from different strands of thinking. Surely the stories coalesce around certain themes. Various writers have their own sort of expectations, and they gather stories that would fit those expectations and represent Jesus in 4 different ways in the 4 Gospels. But nevertheless, one can see that within the Gospels, first of all, among the 4 Gospels, we have 4 distinct basic images, and then within each Gospel you have a collection of various ideas reflected in individual stories and short episodes. So now, to sort out who Jesus was behind all of these stories, so if we take these stories and the Gospels themselves as layers of interpretation of Jesus, then to peel back these layers of interpretation and find Jesus behind, this becomes quite a puzzle for scholars. And it is often remarked that when scholars find Jesus and they give us a depiction of who Jesus was, the scholar often really is depicting a projection of his own mind, because the scholar does not have that much facts about Jesus, that many facts, and the scholar has to work with a few facts selected from a wider pool, and the selection itself of the facts to say, well, this is what we know about Jesus, that selection itself reflects a sort of orientation of the individual scholar.
So do you think that's the case with Reza Aslan as well? His depiction of Jesus is a representation of what, of his own predisposition, perhaps?
Well, I wouldn't say that in his case, or,
Okay.
or in the case of any particular scholar, but every scholar should be aware that we all have our own biases and expectations and so on, and nobody is completely neutral. And in that case, I find his resistance, though on the one hand, in the Fox News interview, there was the continued probing, you're a Muslim, why are you writing a book about Jesus, as though that is so incomprehensible. On the other extreme, we have him protesting that his Muslimness has nothing to do with it. Well, to be sure, his book does not reflect a Muslim sort of predisposition. But
Jesus that he depicts is very different from the Muslim understanding.
yes, and he did say that in the interview, and that comes through in the book as well. For example, he treats the virgin birth story of Jesus as a complete fabrication, whereas Muslims would take exception to that. Most Muslims believe that Jesus was conceived in a miraculous fashion. So too do
The
many
crucifixion as
traditional
well
Christians.
is another
Yes,
issue.
crucifixion is another issue which many traditional Muslims will find to be at odds with the Quranic story about Jesus. So his book does not reflect a Muslim predisposition, but at the same time one cannot deny some sort of predisposition. But does the Jesus that he comes up with reflect his own expectations? I would say no, because this is a depiction that many scholars, Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, have arrived at, and it is based on a very important feature of the Jesus stories, the idea that he was crucified under Roman rule for the crime of sedition.
Okay. We'll leave it at that, Brother Shabir. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return, the quest for inner peace.